So my final bit, I'm going to look at the nature of the branding process, and we're going to look at some contemporary visual branding ideas and trends, and then reflect on what I think they mean for the traditional branding building blocks of a brand in today's screen-based world. And then we're going to look at different ways in which you can manage brands in this post-digital age, and how different organisations with different needs are coping with that. So our starting point is the humble brand book, something we all know and love. Now, I think we all come across these at various times, and it tends to be a very linear, static thing: logo, typefaces, rules, etc. And it's really a sort of starting point for how to do things in an exact way. But I think the problem is these days is that they're books. They tend to not cover enough. They're not maybe practical enough in this day and age, and they're very functional. They're very useful for someone like me who's creating things from a design point of view. But I think, because they're rooted in the old world, the linear, the printed, the finite world of books, sort of with the beginning and an end, they struggle to kind of keep up with what brands need to do now, I think. And what we're seeing now with this modern way is kind of more brand worlds, brand ecosystems, brand languages, or even operating systems. And I think whatever you want to call these new brand books, they're united in their different mode of expression. They talk about the brand as something that's living now, something that's more flexible and something that's more interconnected. So, if you like, the books have moved on to become stories. This quote here sums it up quite well, I think. So, a brand world or style guide is a media-neutral tool which can be used by anyone, internal or external. It can inform all aspects of the brand and should be used as the core filter for all brand activity. Now, I think functionally that works really well, but I think it still lacks something, and that's the human element, much like Rob and Dave have been talking about earlier. And I think it's really important that with these toolkits, with these guides, with these rules, we think about how they're being used and why. They need for me to be more than just how-tos. They should seek to empower the user and inspire people to create, because we say the brands need to live. They need to be something that people can own and grow. So we've got opinions on this. What do we think needs to change? So the first thing for me is that I think we need to allow others to be creative. Now, for that, we have to assume that we've got a good brand, it's solid, it's comfortable in its own skin, and it's communicating that clearly through its core building blocks, so that it can confidently set out clear ground rules and boundaries whilst leaving some room for interpretation and experimentation. So what I mean by that is, think about a brand now giving guidance rather than strict guidelines, because I think there should be enough left to inspire the interpreter, whether that's a designer like me or a writer, or in more general terms an employee, to make something amazing or to be amazing, and to allow them to put something of themselves into what they've done. I think a brand should allow itself to be pushed, because that's really what's going to drive it forwards. We work sometimes as a branding agency, sometimes as a digital agency, sometimes completely integrated. But when we're working under brands, the most inspiring thing for us is when we've got guidelines of a brand that kind of shows us a peek of what's around the corner and inspires us to sort of do interesting things. I think it means that we get excited about things, and means that there's a respect for the people making it, that they want people to do great things with the starting points. Now, obviously, this is all well and good, me saying, well, be more loose with your brand, but whose call is that to make? And I think as an agency, it's vital that we're speaking to the right people from the start. So we're clear on who we need to speak to, who we need to get on board, and who we need to kind of communicate this different way of working to, so that everyone's bought into how we're working and what we're doing. Because if we want to change the way we approach branding, we need confidence not only from ourselves, but also from the top, from the people we're working with, because we need to make sure everyone's in it together. Because I think we can start to do things differently from a process point of view. I think branding projects can become very slow and laboured, especially at the start of the project, where each party is getting to know each other. There's a lot of research, there's a lot of kind of dry data and things like that. But I think if we can get those key decision makers established and everyone clear on what's going on, then I think we can start doing things more quickly and not following a traditional linear path of brand creation. And one thing I want to talk about here is a different way in which we could work, and it's something we've been experimenting with, is making our learnings from the world of software development, namely agile technology, methodology. Agile is defined as this, so characterised by the division of tasks into short phases of work and frequent reassessment and adaptation of plans. I think it's really useful to take, because we don't always know where the end goal is or how you'll get there with software development, and I think with branding, and a kind of world where the future's less certain. I think this is really interesting. I think it's something we should really bear in mind, because we're in a world now where game-changing ideas or technologies can force us to rethink the way we talk about what we do, how we market our product, or even whether how we do things is relevant anymore. Agile's a way where the kind of linear B follows A is replaced with a more flexible way of working. So it allows certain elements to be designed out of sequence, so we can test things, we can allow things to work off each other, and they can be tweaked and improved upon over time, rather than being absolutely crafted and finished before we move on to the next thing. And I think it allows different people to play with rules in a different way, and it allows things to build a sense of momentum. Because I think this sense of momentum and pace is more important than ever in the fast-changing environment we all exist in now. Now, you know, we're all probably busier than ever in that. So this is kind of me saying this and then almost thinking, blimey, I'm stitching myself up here. But I think for me, it's about, if we look at it, say, with an older brand point of view, it might be the key to getting something into market quickly, where they might be playing catch up with a competitor. But for a startup, it might be getting their idea out there while it's still fresh and unique and before someone else does it. So I think these kind of fast turnaround brand pieces also tend to exist more in the digital space, where more startups and disruptive things are happening. And also where certain assumptions have to be made about how the brand behaves, where it's going to behave, and some created as you go along. So going back to the sort of truly agile methodology. This is a recent quote from Essen International's design report, and I think this chimes really well with it. So minimum viable brand is no longer one among many other process perspectives, but a necessity in order to reach an acceptable speed to market. Now, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's something I think is really, really pertinent, because I think we have to accept that in this post-digital world, things can and will exist in a state of continual development and improvement, and that customers, audiences and consumers are becoming more and more used to this. So digital as a medium is constantly changing and shifting, and I think it's really important that us as agencies adapt to this, and we communicate the importance of working differently in branding to our clients, because we have to keep up with the pace of things. So next I want to look at 4 contemporary visual branding trends and reflect on what they mean for the traditional building blocks of a brand in today's screen-based world. I've just kept it to visual branding for the sake of this talk, so we've got some focus, but as you'll see, even that's moving on rapidly. And we go back again to the simple building blocks. So what's the future of the humble logo? And by that I mean specifically what impact is the screen having on something which used to be very fixed, very defined, and above all very static. So first up, looking at static, I'm going to take a look at a brand which has embraced motion into its very nature, really. And this is for a brand called Current, which was an American broadcaster. I think they were one of the few brands which has kind of picked up on the trend of having a moving brand, having a kind of brand which is never still, and actually really bought into what it was as a brand. So their logo is based on a flag, which I think is a great metaphor for change, for celebration, for freedom. And the idea with the Current brand is that it never has one particular fixed state. So this thing can exist in different ways. You can take different grabs of this. There's just this generative film that basically is the brand, so they can take things from it. And I think it's a really interesting way of branding a broadcaster, and kind of really adding a sense of freedom to the message. The next one I want to look at, this is on kind of dynamic branding, and I think more and more as brand designers, we're not the ones creating the final executions. So we need to make sure that the tools we're giving to in-house teams, to external agencies, to third parties are kind of, I can say they're inspiring, but they're also giving rules. So this example is for New York's Whitney Gallery, and I think it's a prime example of a brand identity created with that flexibility and expression in mind. It's very unique, but it really is all about the end user and how they can interpret it. So the logo here, which you could read as a W or a wave or a zigzag, took its inspiration from a line from the gallery's chief curator, which was, it would be much easier to present the history of art as a simplistic line, but that's not the Whitney. So the designers who worked on this identity used that as their starting point to explore the notion of different journeys, to explore the notion of how art becomes, how people experience it, and the changing nature of the gallery and the exhibitions. And this is something that they really have at the core of their brand. And I think it's a really great example of future-proofing an identity and embracing change and challenges, because as you'll see here, the sketches of how this brand could work, how the logo could work, show that it's radically different, and I think show that it's really open to change. But even stripped back right to the raw elements here, so top left where you've got the stationery without any images, you can see that, you know, it's got a very distinct minimal feel and something which is instantly recognisable. As I said at the start, it's not everyone's cup of tea, but I think it's really interesting how they're saying deliberately, right, we aren't going to create this stuff. This is all about the end user having something that they can really work with and actually just have a set of rules. It's as simple as have a line, have 4 points, move them, and then express it from there. So a different kind of thing next is gestural. And I think the best example of this, most high profile in this country, is for Virgin Media. And I think the ads bottom right that have David Tennant amongst other actors working on them work really well, where they're actually engaging with the screen, drawing the logo in, drawing certain things. And I think that worked really well, but I feel where they've got to now is a bit less clear, where the gestural thing is more about kind of abstract brand art. So I think it's one of those things where if you're going to start to bring new ideas or perhaps gimmicky ideas into brands, we need to kind of be sure what they're all about and what they're communicating. I think Airbnb does this slightly better. Their big brand, which they launched early in the year, was all about this new symbol, bellow, which was meant to be something that could be created by anyone and everyone, hence the window drawing here. And they made a really big play on explaining this and making it about everyone being able to explain it. And of course, because of that, it got lambasted on the internet. And this was probably the only safe for work version I could show you. But I think the interesting thing about it is it made people talk. They made a big play of it. It got a lot of PR. It got a lot of negative stuff, but at the same time, it's kind of here today, gone tomorrow. So I think it's an interesting example, and I think it's one that we're going to see brands still start to play with and work out what it means for them. Interestingly, I think where it's used best is in places like sport. So this is, people who aren't football fans, this is the most expensive footballer in the world, Gareth Bale, and he's recently trademarked his 11 of Hearts goal celebration. So what he's going to do with it, I don't know, but I think it's an interesting point of having gestural but also personal branding. So on a much more kind of simplistic level, if you like, is the final trend, which is responsive. Now, we all know about responsive design in websites and how it's going to work on mobile and things like that. And this is an experiment by a London-based designer which kind of takes this on a little bit, but looks at the really standard building blocks of brands. And what he's done here is used existing logo formats, but actually looked at how they might break down and be applied across different formats. So that as well as changing the orientation of a screen, changing type skies, changing type of content, we're actually looking at how a logo can shrink down. And I think this film shows it really well, where we're just looking at how it might work on different devices and how that kind of thing could be something that we build into in the future. Like I say, it's something that designers have done for years, looking at shorthands and things like that, but we all know now the challenges of everyone's brand, what's going to be that social square, what's going to be that app icon. And I think this is just a really neat way of kind of simplifying it and showing it really. So slightly simpler trend, but I think one that's really worth looking at. So finally, we talked about trends. Now I want to look at how we can kind of manage and grow brands in a post-digital world. Go back to our brand book again. As I said, the old way was all about the printed book or manual and tended to be something that lasted longer because brands didn't need to change too much. What they did was a product or a service that stayed the same for quite a long time. And the example I keep using is for New York City Transit Authority or the New York subway, as people know. And I think the interesting thing about this is actually the brand hasn't changed, the product hasn't changed. You go on the subway, it's the same as it was in 1970 when this was made. So, not every brand has to move and change really quickly, but I think where we're at, and most of the brands here today, we are in a position where we need to be changing. So I think what I wanted to look at is, how can we tell that in a different way? How can we, as I said at the start, communicate the fact that a brand needs to be living? So the first example, and the first kind of rule, if you like, is don't overcomplicate things. I don't think brands have to be complicated, unwieldy things, and the way they're communicated and presented can reflect this. So this example is MailChimp. Now, some of you might have used MailChimp. It's an email marketing tool, and as this quote shows, they're not in a kind of sexy category, but they like to do things well. And I think the interesting thing is, for an internet company, they've been around, thousands of years in relative terms, because they've been around 25 years. And I think they have a very clear idea about who they are and a very kind of deep imagination and thinking of what they are. Now, their business is all about the internet, so that's where you find their guidelines. And what I really like about this is it's very simplified The language is very easy. It's almost saying, you know, we're here, we know our rules, this is where it's at. Actually, if you want to get deeper, you can do it. But even things like here saying, well, you know, we have our logo Freddy, who's very kind of humorous, but you can't do things with him, you can't customise him too much. And it's just showing it in a really kind of knowing, simple way. And also they kind of credit the people who need the information. So they have a detailed brand book, which they call the whole shebang, and it can be downloaded for those who need it, but they appreciate that actually people don't all the time, and it just shows it in this simple way, which I think is really neat. The next one is about addressing your audience respectfully. So earlier I talked about giving the user, in that case the designer, inspiring tools to enable them to really create rather than just make. And I think, you know, sometimes brands are just about making, following very specific rules, but I think more and more, you know, as teams come in-house, as we use lots of different suppliers, we need to inspire people in a different way. And I think if you're going to embrace that really collaborative approach, I think it's really important to signpost this and make it clear that you're allowing this to happen. So this is the first page of the website for the brand for Sweden. And just in case it's unclear, so what they say here is this manual is aimed at people who work with Brand Sweden. We know that you're a professional, that's why this manual only contains guidelines and goals for your creativity. There are a few simple rules. Apart from that, challenge yourself. And I really like the directness of this. This is the first thing you see as a user, and I think as a designer, as a creator, this is inspiring. This makes you want to do something really great with this brand. It makes you want to try and stretch the boundaries a little bit, but it wants to make you exceed expectations, and I think it's really empowering. And they kind of back that up, as well as the lengthy how-to section, with really interesting real-life examples. Often with these brand books, this kind of thing, you get a lot of stuff which is very conceptual. This is very real, this is very used, and I think it's really good to sort of see that kind of thing that you know functions as a successful piece of design. Now, sometimes you can't work that way. Sometimes your end user is different, and we found this recently when we worked on the global rebrand for the messaging app Viber. And the biggest challenge we faced with this was that it exists in many countries around the world, but it was marketed in very different ways, and it had to be rolled out by territory marketing managers using local agencies. So for us, we had rather than a kind of a level of expectation about who was creating it, we really didn't know who would be. So we had to adjust that accordingly and assume a much lower level of expertise. So what we tried to do with the brand identity here was create a system where people could input local flavour into it by using language, by using photography, but actually the way everything treated was very dictated, and that was even done down to the fact that we had Photoshop actions, we had how-to videos and things like that. So certain things were very free, certain things were very controlled. But what we found over the time is a lot of their content is social, is that actually, because we allowed certain things to be clearly defined, like the brand typeface, like the purple, it means there is still a real strength to what they do, even where people go off and do more sort of local things or do more things that perhaps break the brand a little bit. And I think that's one of those things where, especially with a brand like this, where it's existing in the social world, you know, as a brand guardian, as a brand owner, you have to accept that certain things will go awry. So it's making sure that the toolkit they got is strong enough to support that. And then the final example is look to the future as best you can. Now, obviously the best example of that is someone like Google. So what we're going to look at here is their recent material design guidelines. And in their own words, we challenged ourselves to create a visual language for our users that synthesises the classic principles of good design with the innovation and possibility of technology and service. And I think more importantly, through the formats I'll show you, they also made it clear from the start that this is a living document. And I think it's something that more and more, especially with digital projects, that's the way we need to be thinking about things. Everything can move, everything can change. And as you can imagine, the guidelines for Google products are very detailed and cover a lot of ground. So what they do alongside that is create more abstract videos like this, where you're kind of setting out the rules, but in a really sort of simple, expansive storytelling way. So you start to sort of see a UI building up, you start to see things that you know relate to responsive screens, and it sort of shows you this, takes you into this world without signposting it with voiceover or with narration. And I think also it captures the scale of the project brilliantly. It sort of shows that this is the thing that's growing. It starts from simple things but could actually become a much bigger thing. And it also brings the stuff to life in different ways. So this is exploring their 5 core concepts. This is an experimental HTML5 site, and it's just starting to show how how the core concepts of material design are based in the sort of physical world. So looking at how things interact with each other as solid objects, how things split. And it's just a really simple way of actually showing, okay, I get this is based on the real world. And what was really interesting was for the launch of their material design stuff last year, they went right back to our old print to show how this could work. And I think it was because in conceiving material design, what they actually took inspiration from was, as well as kind of real world physics, was things like paper, was tactile things, was layering, was space and light. Because they wanted to create an interface that felt really tangible and grounded in reality, and they wanted to create something that, because it was based on those real building blocks, it was them. It wasn't a version of Apple's iOS, it wasn't a version of Microsoft's Tiles, and it's really important they had this kind of backbone to it. And like I say, what was really interesting about this is actually what you come back to is a brand book of sorts, a printed thing. So because it's based in that real world, based around humans interacting, this was in the end the best way to tell the story. So, as we've all said today, and we keep banging on, things are changing more quickly than ever wherever you look. And no one really knows in their sector where the next Netflix or Uber or any of these disruptive things is going to do to our traditional business models. And for that reason, we have to be ready and open to change. I think the branding world we're in is no longer about absolute rules. And we need to start viewing brands as continually evolving things rather than things that are completely defined. So to help break this talk down into a few easy takeaways, I'll leave you with 5 simple lines. First one is brands don't have to be branded. And what I mean by that is I don't think they have to be so locked down or so rigid. I think they're going to have to become freer, more comfortable with living a little, and be a little bit more open to change and evolution, and in a much shorter time frame than we've perhaps been used to in the past. I think rules can be overruled because sometimes brand rules don't work for new uses or need to flex in different ways that technology has only just shown us needed. We need to be open to evolving our brand and embracing what new technologies force us to do. So we need to let people take risks and try a more agile, iterative approach to exploring new areas. I think corporations don't have to be corporate. They don't have to act like dinosaurs and adopt a dyed-in-the-wool approach to our brands. I think there's some really innovative branding being commissioned by high-profile organisations who see the need to take risks and show their innovative side through branding that reflects this innovative thinking. And it's about giving guidance, not stifling guidelines. So the brand's, I think, only as powerful as those creating it. And if we give guidance and positively manage and encourage those who work on the brand, then I think we enable things to thrive and grow, and we get some unexpected, really nice things from that, I think. Because, as Dave mentioned, I think it's ultimately all about user experience. And it's really important that everything we do comes back to that human interaction, comes back to the people using it. Whether that's in the tone of voice someone reads from a brand's point of sale, as Rob took us through, or in their experience of doing something in a really new and different way, as Dave talked about. We're all here to service a user, essentially, and we need to do what we can to help them experience our brands in the way we want them to. Thank you.